नहीं सबको रखे
করেছি হ্যালো ঠিক আছে Good evening to all from this part of the world. Good morning to our speakers from US. Today is a very special day, 8th of August. This is special because in 1942, on 8th of August, Gandhiji had declared the Bharat Chodo Andolan, which is Quit India movement. Today, this is the first of a series of symposia that IIT Kharagpur is doing to commemorate the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And we are doing it with global institutes of the world. Today, we are collaborating with MIT and with the Gandhi Forum. And I would now request our director, Professor V.K. Tiwari, to kindly inaugurate this series of e-Symposia with his opening address. Professor Tiwari, please.
Well, good morning to you in US, and good evening to people in India. I'm very happy that this particular series has been started in IIT Kharagpur. In fact, in 2014, when the Prime Minister of India then said from the Red Fort that can we give in the 150th year to our Mahatma a Swachh Bharat. This is what he has said at that time. In fact, not only that, the various activities of Swachh Bharat, Swavalamban, or Swabhiman, or you can say that any activity that he started way back when he was alive. Everything we are reinventing for that matter. And right from that time, you must have seen that this country has, in a big way, started Swachh Bharat, and we have achieved to a great extent. Swavalamban, we have achieved to a great extent. Sarvodaya, yes, this government has started various activities. You must have seen that we are talking of giving gas cylinders to everyone, the toilets to every house, and things like that. Various other programs which this government started. In fact, those were the visions of our Mahatma. We know Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, his full name, but we call him Bapu. And in fact, in 1944, on 6th of July, our great leader and freedom fighter Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose has said and called him for the first time as the father of the nation. And right from that time, we are calling him as the father of the nation. The inspirations which he has given to the world, not only to India, are tremendous. Many leaders across the world have got inspiration from him, stimulated because of his ideas and hard work and the directions that he gave to the whole humanity in this world. We are very fortunate to have him at that time, because of which this country became independent. Of course, we could not see him beyond the independence, less than a year only. But then he has given great things to us. We are very much aware of his three Mahatma Gandhi ke teen mandar. There he had said that bura dekho, na bura suno, and na bura kaho. These three things, by the way of the three monkeys, in fact, has spread into every child's mind as to what are these things which we should not do. He thought, in fact, you must have heard that people, lot of touchabilities concept was there at that time. People were not, the lower caste people were not allowed to come to the places of worship, as well as even to the places where water, etc., were shared by other villagers, other people in the society. And in fact, he removed this untouchability and he used to call such people as Harijans. And he used to say that we are all the people of God, Harijans. Hari means Bhagwan, Ishwar. He told them. And in fact, at that time, when he saw the condition of this country, he thought that the only way we can really become independent is by having our own way of doing things, our own way of establishing ourselves, our own way of helping each other to see that everyone flourishes with equal opportunity in each and every aspect of life, whether it is education, whether it is sharing the amenities or the infrastructure. And hence, from there only, we had the concept of Sarvodaya, Sabka Uday, and then Swavalamban, the independence, or the people should be able to stand on their own feet. That we are calling today, we are talking of startups, we are calling of entrepreneurship, we are calling of scaling. These are the various names through which whatever he used to say at that time. In fact, there is a saying he used to say that if a person comes to you, do not give him money, but give him an idea. Because if you give him money, he will spend that money and next day again he will come. But if you give him an idea, by that idea he will be able to learn and earn, and so he will be able to feed another person. Those were the things which he told us. And we are so fortunate that today we have got three eminent people who will be talking in this first webinar, which we have started at IIT Kharagpur. In fact, the government of India wanted, then in this 150th year, there are various ways by which we can celebrate. And they gave us you can say that an agenda about a month back that connect with your peers outside the world who can talk about Mahatma, because he is a universal figure or he is an international figure. And we wanted to hear from people outside this world. And that is why when I sat about a month back with my four office deans, and immediately, in fact, I was not thinking that it would be possible, but my friends have done a tremendous job. And within less than 3 weeks' time, they could create the agenda. And we are there in the series in the whole month of August. We are going to have a series of such stalwarts talking on Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, we have a plan to also record this, and maybe that we will have to put a report of these particular webinars to the government of India before 1st of September. And I'm very happy that my friends, my colleagues have made this effort and come out with these webinars in the series. We are very happy to get our Professor Chattopadhyay, who is leading the group today. We have with us Professor Sriman Bhattacharya, who is the Deputy Director of this institute and who has been helping, who in fact is also a batchmate of my time. And then we are friends here and we are helping each other in running this institute. We have with us another two professors, three professors, Professor Professor Anandrup and Bhattacharya and Professor Vaiduryu Bhattacharya and Professor Sujay Pal. Now, and we have, in fact, the most important role which has been given today is Madam Anjali Gira Rai, and I am very happy that she accepted this offer, and she has been there. You might have seen on the dry run day also she were making the efforts to see that everything goes on well. We are very happy to get all of us here from this side, and I am also happy to get Vishwapriya Sanyal from MIT, as well as Brian from MIT, and Madam Sobhana ji from the other side. We are very eager to listen to each one of you. With this, I inaugurate this webinar and hand over to Professor Chattopadhyay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Sir. That was really a fantastic opening for this series of e-Symposia. You have really set the tone for this, and I really thank you from the bottom of the heart. for explaining the Gandhian thoughts and philosophy so well, so lucidly. Now, it's my pleasant duty to introduce the speakers. The first speaker that I'm going to introduce now is Professor Bishoprio Sanyal. Professor Bishoprio Sanyal is a distinguished alumnus of my institute, IIT Kharagpur, and is one of the brightest jewels of my department, Architecture and Regional Planning. Professor Bishoprio Sanyal is Ford International Professor of Urban Development and Planning at MIT. He also directs MIT's program for mid-career professionals from around the world. Professor Sanyal's research and teaching focuses on ways in which urban planning can be used to improve the quality of life of vast majority of urban dwellers. His work focuses on people who have to cope with poverty, disease, political manipulation, and deep uncertainty about their life chances. Professor Sanyal's research was inspired by his association with the Self-Employed Women's Association called SEWA. This is India's first labor union of informal sector workers, which was started by Madam Ila Bhatt, a Gandhian activist organizer. Professor Bishoprio Sanyal will be invited by our moderator, Professor Anjali Roy, and she will introduce the topic, and then we will be over to Professor Sanyal.
Thank you, Professor Chattopadhyay. Good morning, Professor Sanyal. Good evening to those who are listening to us in India, and good morning to those who are listening to us in the rest of the world. We couldn't ask for a better speaker, more distinguished speaker than Professor Sanyal to kick off this series, this symposia that we have planned throughout this month. And the theme on which he will be speaking is Sarvodaya. Now, in the race to keep up with the rest of the world, particularly the developed world, and intoxicated by mediatized images of India shining and our booming economy, India and the rest of the world cannot afford to forget that without Sarvodaya, which the Sanskrit word translating as uplift, universal uplift and progress for all, development is meaningless. As you are aware, and many of you would be aware, that Sarvodaya was the title of Gandhiji's translation, 1908 translation of John Ruskin's book, Unto the Last, in which he talked about ideas of egalitarianism and social justice. But in Gandhiji's hands, it acquired a new twist because he reinterpreted it in the light of what was needed in India. This was a book and this was a thinker who influenced him greatly. We can't wait to hear what Professor Sanyal has to say on the theme of Sarvodaya. And without any further ado, I would not come between your 1,000 registered speakers, more than 1,000 registered speakers, and you. Over to you, Professor Sanyal.
Thank you. Alex, listen. Thank you, Subrata and Anjali, for organizing this event. Can you hear me? And also for inviting me to participate in celebrating the 150th Gandhi Jayanti. Thanks to the director of IIT Kharagpur Dr. V.K. Tiwari, and other senior members of the administrations who are joining us this morning, IIT faculty, students, and alumni who may be joining us also for this event. I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you all, especially with two other panelists, Dr. Radhakrishnan and my mighty colleague, Professor Brent Ryan. To speak at this event is an honor for me in two ways. First, it is an honor to speak on Gandhiji. The more I read about Gandhiji, the more I am in awe about how he led us, the people of India, towards political and moral independence. A second reason I feel honored is to return to my alma mater, IIT Kharagpur, where I learned the fundamental principles of my profession. More importantly, perhaps, IIT Kharagpur is where I got the first glimpse of the diversity of India with students from all across the nation. What an important lesson that was to appreciate our regionally diverse democratic nation. I'm really in awe how Gandhiji unified this diverse nation and its heterogeneous population with a common moral thread, of which the notion of Sarvodaya was a key element. Since much has been written about Sarvodaya, I will not reiterate what we already know about the origin of the idea and its multiple interpretations. What intrigues me is what we can learn from efforts to implement the idea. In this regard, I had the opportunity to study, quote, one experiment with truth, unquote, if I may borrow that phrase, by an organization of poor women who eked out a meager living in the urban informal economy in Ahmedabad. The organization, known as the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, was started by Ela Bhatt in 1971 when Ahmedabad's textile mills were closing down, creating large-scale unemployment. Lacking any unemployment benefit or other Western-style social welfare programs, the families of the textile workers were left to fend for themselves and relied on the little income the women of the households were able to earn in the informal economy through petty trading in the streets of Ahmedabad. Ela Ben, a Gandhian at heart and in action, who used to serve as a volunteer social worker in the women's wing of the Textile Labor Association, empathized with the plight of these families. And she wanted to protect their meager income, which was vulnerable for multiple reasons, foremost among which was police harassment and large-scale evictions from the street pavements where they sold vegetables. It was clearly the awareness of Sarvodaya which inspired Ela Ben to act. But she knew that these women needed more than her sympathy to survive and live with dignity. She also knew that her appeal to the moral consciousness of Ahmedabad's powerful business and political elite was not enough either. This was not a new insight, however, because 20 years back, the Bhudan movement, led by Vinoba Bhave, had faltered because it had relied primarily on the power of moral persuasion for land redistribution. Ela Ben knew that the poor women needed to organize, but neither as a traditional social welfare group nor as a new political party with a hierarchical organization. She wanted to create a grassroots-based membership organization of women in the informal economy, which would be taken seriously by dominant organizations such as the municipal government and the police. As someone well connected to the Textile Labor Association, which had a major say about who was to be India's labor minister since independence, Elaben thought that SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, should also be a formally registered trade union of informal sector workers who would then be taken seriously. It was not easy to create the world's first trade union of the self-employed, a term Elaben coined to convey respect for petty traders, street vendors, and garbage scavengers, because these workers did not have the traditional employer-employee relationship, which was to be the basis for organizations of conventional trade unions. SEWA is now considered a model worldwide of how to strengthen the bargaining power of informal sector workers. Did it happen because the city elites had a change of heart? No. It happened because SEWA showed the way in which the Indian Constitution could be used to protect the vulnerable. In one of its first acts of organizing as a trade union, SEWA went beyond mere protests to stop the eviction of street vendors. It filed a lawsuit, a public litigation case, against the Ahmedabad municipality for violating its members' constitutional right as Indian citizens to be able to earn a living. And after a long, drawn process which went to the Supreme Court, SEWA won the case. Ahmedabad municipality was ordered to find alternative sites for the vegetable vendors so they could earn a living. It is interesting that such legal battles were not part of the Gandhian approach to Sarvodaya, even though Gandhiji himself practiced as a lawyer in South Africa. For sure, Gandhiji knew the power of law, particularly how to disobey unjust laws. But his ultimate goal was to change the heart of the oppressors by appealing to their moral consciousness. His goal was not to win legal battles. Instead, he wanted to totally transform individual consciousness from within. And towards that end, he was ready to use nonviolent political strategies such as satyagraha. But as we know, Gandhiji's preachings of Sarvodaya had not led to more egalitarian land redistribution, despite much hard work by Vinoba Bhave and others to change the hearts of India's landed elites. What led to actual land redistribution, first in Kerala and later in West Bengal, was the firm determination and strong action by the state governments to redistribute land legally. Elaben was quite aware of what it takes to institutionalize social change. And even though she saw herself as representing civil society, she knew that she would have to deal with the government to formalize public policies to help SEWA members. A second example of how SEWA as an organization practiced Sarvodaya was the creation of the SEWA Bank. Energized by the central government's banking reforms in the early 1970s, which required that poor households be provided access to credit from nationalized banks, SEWA created a bank in the mold of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Till then, it was widely believed that the poor were not creditworthy. Seva Bank demonstrated that this was a wrong perception. And through excellent management of the poor women's meager savings, Seva met every banking stipulation laid out by India's nationalized banking system. I provide this example to highlight the point that prior to the creation of Seva, the poor women depended mainly on private money lenders for credit and paid very high interest rates. Seva did not try to change the hearts and minds of these loan sharks, nor did it violently threaten money lenders to forgive debts. Instead, what Seva did was to create an alternative institution to bypass the exploitative system and demonstrated to the poor women that they could reduce their vulnerability through pooling their own resources. I could go on and on with many other examples of how Seva, led by Ilaben, actually practiced Sarvodaya. But since we want to hear from other speakers, let me conclude by highlighting one lesson I learned from studying Seva. That to change the dominant view of informal workers as illegal, unhygienic, uneducated, and in general as a social problem, to a new appreciation of them as self-employed entrepreneurs who provide essential goods and services for urban residents. That kind of change of attitude cannot be achieved by appealing to the moral consciousness of individuals. What is required is organizing, strategizing, coalition building, and also the ability to work pragmatically with both public and private entities to change public policies, and more importantly, to hold institutions accountable that indeed they actually implement these policies. For a nation like India, with deep structural inequalities and widespread disregard for dignity of all labor, the notion of Sarvodaya remains as relevant as when it was conceived by Gandhiji in 1908. What is needed, however, is that we better understand how to implement this noble goal as social action. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sanyal, for... Can you hear me? Thank you, Professor Sanyal, for that, walking us through the fascinating journey of Seva, which is not merely a union of textile workers, but also has diversified in so many issues. We'll return to Seva, but we must now move on to the next speaker, and I request Professor Chattopadhyay to introduce our next speaker, Professor Brent Ryan.
Thank you very much, Professor Anjali Roy. I take pleasure now to introduce my friend, collaborator, and professor of MIT, Brent D. Ryan, who's the head of the City Design and Development Group at MIT. He is Associate Professor of Urban Design and Public Policy in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. His research focuses on the aesthetics and policies of contemporary urban design. It looks at current and pressing issues like deindustrialization and climate change. Professor Ryan's first book, Design After Decline: How America Rebuilds Shrinking Cities, was selected by Planetizen as one of its 10 best urban planning books of 2012, and I've read it. It's fantastic. His second book, The Largest Art, was published by MIT Press in 2017. His article, Reading Through a Plan, was awarded Best Article of 2011, and the list goes on. He's a prolific writer. Professor Ryan has also written numerous chapters for books, including the Routledge Companion to Urban Design, The City After Abandonment, Urban Landscape, the Oxford Handbook of Urban Planning, and so on and so forth. Professor Ryan is currently conducting research in China, examining the urban design dimensions of emerging shrinking cities and the urban design futures of new town expansion projects. He's also working in Ukraine, he's working in Siberian cities, but most interestingly, he has a deep connect with India. He has worked in Gujarat, and we are now working on a brownfield exercise taking both sides of the Hooghly River. Prior to joining MIT, Professor Ryan taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is a BS in biology from Yale, MArch from Columbia University, and a PhD in urban design and planning from MIT. I would now request Professor Anjali Roy to introduce the topic for Professor Brent Ryan, and then it will be over to Brent.
Good morning, Professor Ryan. Your theme is a tongue twister, Swavlamban. Like the Sarvodaya movement, which was inspired by John Ruskin's book, here it was Tolstoy who was Gandhiji's influence, and the idea of dignity of labor and self-reliance, which became his motto, particularly in the Swadeshi movement, and also the symbolic acts of the salt march, as well as burning foreign cloth. These were resistive acts to end the hegemony of the colonizing powers and make India self-reliant. We'd love to have your take on this theme of Swavlamban, which means self-reliance. Professor Ryan.
My name is Brent Ryan, and I'm joining you from Brookline, Massachusetts, in the Boston area. Brookline is a garden suburb of Boston. We like to think of Brookline as self-reliant, has some relationship to some of the self-reliance urban design concepts that I'll be showing you this evening. I'm honored to have been asked to participate in this evening's virtual conference on Gandhian thoughts and philosophy, and I'm eager to increase my cooperation with IIT Kharagpur, and I'm looking forward to my upcoming visits when international travel is again possible. I've been asked, as Anjali said, to speak on this theme of Svavalamban, which I understand in translation as meaning that one is capable of doing things for oneself, or that one can meet one's own needs without reliance to others. And in the context of India's independence history, the legacy of Svavalamban thinking is obviously substantial and the need great. Perhaps the most familiar iteration of self-reliance was India's drive for self-sufficiency in the decades after independence. Economic self-sufficiency is certainly one way to understand this concept. But tonight, I would like to speak to the relevance of Svavalamban in my particular research area of urban design and the built environment. In fact, there is a long history of appreciation, promotion, and construction of self-reliant human settlements in contemporary urban planning and design. And I'll speak briefly tonight about two aspects of self-reliance, or Svavalamban, in urban design thinking. The first concept is one called the neighborhood unit. This concept was prevalent throughout much of the 20th century and has substantial applicability to Indian urbanization. And the second is the concept of the sustainable neighborhood, which I think is a concept that is applicable and will be increasingly predominant to all cities in the 21st century. In both cases, we see the lure and attraction of the concept of self-reliance as a means for urban dwellers to attain a better quality of life in the midst of growing urban areas. This is a familiar challenge for urban planners and urban designers and architects. But how realistic is Swabalamban as a goal for urban design? I'll return to that question at the end of my presentation. Right now, I'm going to share my screen and show some images, and if one of the audience could please confirm that this is functioning, it will allow me to proceed with confidence. Is my screen being shared correctly?
Yes.
Brent.
It is. So you can see the neighborhood unit here. Excellent. In 1929, American architect Clarence Perry proposed the neighborhood unit, the concept that we see on the left. This was an extremely influential urban design concept that was translated around the world and that remains attractive even today. It was inspired by the Garden City idea that emerged in the United Kingdom in the late 19th century. And there's several key urban design ideas that we can recognize here in the neighborhood unit, and that we can also see translated in Indian cities like Chandigarh. First is the centering of the school in the neighborhood together with religious buildings, here churches, in part of a community center. You can see that at the center of the neighborhood. Second, arterial streets carrying heavy traffic are placed at the perimeter. This protects neighborhoods from heavy traffic and makes the highways more efficient at the perimeter. Third, internal streets are designed in a hierarchy. You can see nice arrangements of small parks and triangular neighborhood internal streets, all leading you to the center and to the periphery. Fourth, shopping is restricted to the periphery or main entrance adjacent to transit. And you can see that at the three corners of this neighborhood unit. Lastly, at least 10% of the neighborhood unit should not be dedicated to settlement, but should be dedicated to parks and open space. And this was a revolutionary concept in 1930 when neighborhoods were being built with no open space. And it's still a revolutionary concept today when most cities are woefully short of open space. On the right, we can see that the neighborhood unit is part of a larger network. In fact, the city was composed of a constellation of neighborhood units. And again, the analogy to cities like Chandigarh is obvious with roundabouts at the intersection of these different neighborhoods. Today, the neighborhood unit is still projected as a vision of a sustainable neighborhood, as in this vision created just about 10 years ago by Farr and Associates. Let's think about where we see self-reliance in the neighborhood unit. It's actually visible in many ways. First, think of the lives of people who stay at home. In 1930, this was women. However, today, it's everyone, since I've been confined at home for 5 months due to coronavirus. Many of us are spending our entire day at home in our neighborhoods. At the time, inhabitants could spend their entire day or even entire week within the neighborhood unit. All their local needs could be addressed: school, friends, recreation, and local shopping. And especially the needs of children were entirely met by the neighborhood unit because schools lay at the center. Additionally, since the unit was linked to a train system, it was easy for workers to leave and return in time to enjoy the space. In other words, the neighborhood unit projected the contemporary city as an almost entirely self-reliant unit of space that was defined by design. The neighborhood unit was brought to India by Charles Correa, among others, in his design for the Navi Mumbai New Town in the 1970s. At the center of his neighborhood unit, Correa placed a Maidan, and the neighborhood also contains service industries, as you can see in the top left. That would be small local industries to employ neighborhood residents, as well as transport facilities and institutions. And one can easily imagine the cottage-scale industries favored by Gandhi occurring in small spaces, such as the courtyards, community spaces, or small yards of Navi Mumbai, shown here in some of Correa's drawings. And here's an image of one of these neighborhood courtyard spaces created by Correa in the 1970s when it was first built. In fact, I've seen many village industries, such as pottery making, in Gujarat occurring in precisely these kinds of spaces. This is the village of Badalpara in Gujarat, where pottery is a traditional craft. So Correa was speaking to that Indian reality of the village space that could be used for manufacturing and tying back to this larger concept, this global concept of the neighborhood unit. Self-reliance remains a very powerful idea in urban design today. As one architect, Michael Sorkin, said, and I quote, "In an era of incompetent nation states and predatory corporations, we must increase local self-reliance. And the most logical increment of this organization and resistance is the city." Here are some of Sorkin's visions of urban farming in New York City, showing New York transformed from a global city into a series of self-reliant, sustainable neighborhoods. Here, the streetscape is transformed into a productive landscape. And the ideal is a very powerful concept. It's to make the city not a parasite upon the environment, but a productive space that's contributing positively back to the environment. Let's think about the notions and components of self-reliance that we can see in these images. First, and perhaps most importantly, given the global crisis, we see energy self-reliance with reduction of fossil fuel use, utilization of wind power, and also reduction of heat gain with shading from vegetation. Second, you can see people planting gardens in what formerly was dedicated to asphalt. This is food self-reliance, where food is grown on site rather than being shipped from thousands of kilometers away. This reduces exploitation, use of fossil fuels, and damage to the environment. Third, we have social self-reliance, where neighboring and friendship is organized around local living units. Fourth, we have economic self-reliance, where we see people growing their own food and acting as small local entrepreneurs. Fifth, we see educational self-reliance, where children are learning within a teaching environment. Their own environment becomes their school, and they can learn from their surroundings instead of strictly from a curriculum. And I think that's even more important today, where most of the world's children are actually being homeschooled. No one ever thought that we would arrive in this situation. Sorkin's vision is very strong here. And here we see the city being reorganized into a series of contained, self-reliant living units. Again, it's a version of the neighborhood unit translated to the sustainability needs of the 21st century. And another version here. So in closing, I'd like to discuss a couple of issues. Could the city of New York, and by extension other cities, really create their own food, energy, and other needs within their own borders? This is an ideal for today's sustainable and self-reliant city. But how we will realize this remains an open question. Here we see Gandhi's concept of Swavalambana translated into environmental thinking and into problem solving for the most challenging of global and contemporary problems. The challenge of living within our own environmental capacities. This is an unmet challenge today. MIT is dedicating, I think, in the next 5 years, upwards of $50 million in faculty grants to address this issue. It's a very pressing challenge. And I'm excited to see that the built environment, urban design, and urban planning can play a major role in attempting to address these challenges. Am I visible again? I'm no longer sharing screen. Thank you. In closing, I hope I've made a convincing case that Gandhi's concept of Swabalamban has been an animating force, not only in social thinking and in political circles, but in urban design and urban planning during the past century. And even more important, as my colleague Professor Sanyal illustrated, Gandhi's concepts are stronger than ever today as we struggle to build a sustainable city. The Gandhian concept of economic self-reliance in Swabalamban is paired in urban design with exciting visions of energy self-reliance, food self-reliance, and social and educational self-reliance. I see a bright and meaningful future for Swabalamban thinking in urban design in the years to come, and I'm honored to have been asked to share my ideas with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ryan, for applying Gandhiji's idea of self-reliance in the context of urban planning, the concept of the neighborhood, making cities self-sufficient. And if we think of cities in the original sense of the polis, one does think of cities as self-sufficient. We'll return to the cities and self-reliance in the context of urban design and planning, but we must now move on to our third speaker of the day. May I request Professor Chattopadhyay to introduce the third speaker, Dr. Radhakrishnan. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce none other than Dr. Shobhana Radhakrishna, who is a globally renowned Gandhian. She is recognized for her invaluable contribution to literature, social service, and spreading vision of Mahatma Gandhi. She is the chief functionary of SCOPE, which is the Standing Conference of Public Enterprises, Gandhian Forum for Ethical Corporate Governance, and advisor, Gandhipedia, Government of India. Shobhana Radhakrishna's cherished aim is to reintroduce Mahatma Gandhi to the people of India as well as those abroad. She believes Mahatma Gandhi's thought and principles can guide the people as it has the strength to inspire and bring about change. Shobhana imbibed Gandhiji's values as she grew up in his ashram, situated at Sevagram in Wardha. Shobhana's focal point is the Gandhian way of life and serving humanity. Her lectures and training programs have highlighted the relevance of ethics and values, as well as the great heights one can achieve with Mahatma Gandhi, serving as a role model for transformational leadership and sustainable development. She is the guest faculty for the Company Directors Training Program conducted by Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs of Ministry of Corporate Affairs. An avid traveler, she has traveled internationally to hold invited lectures on the transformational leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. May I request Professor Anjali to introduce Shobhana's topic, and it will then be over to Shobhana, Madam.
Thank you, Professor Chattopadhyay. Good evening, Dr. Radhakrishnan. We have all learned about Gandhiji's ideas from books, his writings, and writings about Gandhiji. You are indeed fortunate that you had the opportunity to live, to grow up in the ashram and practice what Gandhiji said. There could be none better than you to tell us about Gandhiji's philosophy and thoughts. May I now request you to tell us something about growing up in the ashram and about his philosophy and thoughts. Are you able to hear me? I don't think she can. May I repeat? I don't think she can hear me.
I can.
You.
I can. So, namaste. I thank the director of IIT Kharagpur, the faculty members, Professor Subrita Bhattacharya, all the learned professors for having invited me today in the webinar to speak on Gandhiji's thought and philosophy. And I'm very honored to be here. I also greet my panel of speakers and all the viewers who have joined me online from both our countries. I will describe Gandhiji's philosophy in as simple a way as possible, and that too from my personal experience. Gandhiji had established his last ashram in Sevagram in Wardha, which is near Nagpur, in Maharashtra, in 1936, where he and Kasturba Gandhi, along with the ashram inhabitants, lived in voluntary poverty, followed Ekadasha Vrata, and carried on the experiments in Rachanatmak Karyakram or constructive programs for reaching out to the poorest of the poor in India living in the villages, for establishing their dignity and self-respect, as well as to make them participate in the ongoing freedom struggle. Gandhiji's ashram had a mingling of political and spiritual aims. It was a practical laboratory for transforming ordinary men and women into extraordinary satyagrahis, for offering the highest sacrifice in the freedom struggle on one hand, and to get involved in the constructive programs as karyakartas or social workers. And Gandhiji had started 18 constructive programs from Sevagram. So these programs were to get the grassroots level villagers to take part in the freedom struggle, as well as to establish their dignity. That was his way of reaching out to the millions living in the innumerable villages in India to participate in the Purna Swaraj or complete independence by truthful and non-violent means. Gandhiji had said that complete independence through truth and non-violence means the independence of every unit, be it the humblest of the nation, without distinction of race, color, or creed. This independence is never exclusive. It is therefore wholly compatible with interdependence within or without, he had said. So the 18 constructive programs were communal unity, removal of untouchability, prohibition, khadi, village industries, village sanitation, Nai Talim or basic education, adult education, working with women, disseminating the knowledge of health and hygiene, encouraging provincial languages, focusing on the national language, economic inequality, working with farmers, labor, Adivasi, lepers, leprosy patients, and students. And he added that one can expand on these activities as the scope of these activities widens. It was his ideal of a non-violent face-to-face society of Sarvodaya, Swavalamban, Swachhata, and Seva for realizing the vision of Gram Swaraj. The inmates of the ashram ate in the common kitchen, and the food was grown in the adjoining fields. Everyone had to work. The entire concept of bread labor, which he included from Tolstoy's writing, was implemented in the ashram, and wove and spun to make clothes, used locally available resources for making environment-friendly huts. Children attended the Nai Talim school in the village, which was just next door. Even I am a student of Nai Talim, and nobody entertained a desire to accumulate or acquire anything of his or her own. It was a total life of Swavalamban or self-reliance. Gandhiji kept account of every pie that was spent. In South Africa also. In South Africa itself, he had stopped even charging for his own service as a lawyer. For public service, he refused to take any money. All this not only endeared him to his followers, but inspired them also to follow him as far as possible. This naturally resulted in a kind of joy and willing participation in the cause he was espousing. Gandhiji has given 3 gifts to humanity. The first one is Satyagraha, about which lots of people know many things, but not everything. The second one is constructive program, about which people are not very well aware. And the third is the Ekadasha Vrata, or the 11 rules of conduct that he had laid down for the ashram inmates. Any rule that is followed for the whole life becomes an observance. And those observances were for developing the inner qualities of a satyagrahi. I was born and brought up in Sevagram Ashram. My father was inspired by Gandhiji since his student days. He participated in the freedom struggle and lived in the ashram. Even after Gandhiji passed on in 1948, for 5 decades, my parents and all of us continued to walk on the path shown by Gandhiji to humanity. In the post-Gandhian period, or the Sarvodaya movement, spearheaded by Saint Vinoba Bhave and Jayaprakash Narayanji, my father became one of the strong pillars of the Sarvodaya movement and worked under these 2 stalwarts. And all of us also worked to realize Gandhiji's vision of Gram Swaraj and Sarvodaya to Swavalamba. According to my understanding, Mahatma Gandhi's life was an epic of faith and endeavor. His faith was in truth, the ultimate reality of truth, and he endeavored to attain it through non-violence throughout his life till the very last breath. The deeper the faith, the greater was the endeavor. He said, "Truth is God, Satya hi Parameshwar hai." Faith in truth led Mahatma Gandhi to 2 other realizations. If God is omnipresent, and if each human being were an aspect of God, then each person was capable of good, of being good and doing good to others. His endeavor throughout his life was devoted to the search of that element of truth, to awaken it and to nurture it. This is why he could feel oneness with everyone. For most of us, this realization does not set in easily, but this was one of the most important traits in Gandhiji. Because of this trait of this understanding of oneness, Gandhiji had no enemies. He did not want to settle scores with anyone, and he did not want to take any revenge. He merely wanted to extend his love, compassion, and respect for everyone. He respected individuals as individuals without attaching any labels. And this was another of his traits. Perhaps the greatest source of strength for Mahatma Gandhi was in his faith in God. Truth was the deepest and the most complete form of God. That faith gave him the constant awareness that he was to be nothing but an instrument in his hands. He was to go wherever he was led. For him, the guidance of God constituted two things. One, he had to walk on the path enlightened by truth that was available to him in whatever measures and form. Two, he had to constantly gaze inwards and find inspiration through Atma-Nirikshan, self-introspection, Atma-Parikshan, self-examination, and Atma-Sanchodhan, self-purification. This he did by repeated questioning. And the question was, O Aham, which has been asked in our ancient Indian civilization since the past 5,000 years. Who am I? What am I? And what is the purpose of my life? He got the answer that the only purpose in life is that of serving others. Gandhian philosophy is the religious and social ideas adopted and developed by Gandhiji in 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and South Africa. From a very early in life, Gandhiji understood the universe to be an organic whole. Gandhiji's philosophy exists on several planes: the spiritual or religious, moral, educational, political, economic, social, individual, and collective. For Gandhiji, the spiritual or religious element and God are at its core. He regarded human nature as being fundamentally virtuous and believed that all individuals are capable of high moral development and reform. The 3 cardinal principles of Gandhian philosophy are Satya or truth, Ahimsa or non-violence, and purity of means. For Gandhiji, truth is the relative truth of truthfulness in thought, word, and deed. And the absolute truth is the ultimate reality. The ultimate truth is God. And morality, the moral laws and code its basis. So ahimsa or non-violence, far from meaning mere peacefulness or the absence of over-violence, is understood by Gandhiji to denote active love. Gandhiji's non-violence stems from 2 main points. First, if according to the divine reality, all life is one, then all violence committed towards another is violence towards oneself, towards the collective, own self, and thus self-destructive and counter to the universal law of life, which is love. Second, Gandhiji believed that non-violence is the most powerful force in existence. Had violence been superior to non-violence, humankind would long ago have succeeded in destroying itself. The human race certainly could not have progressed as far as it has, even if universal justice remains far off the horizon. From both viewpoints, nonviolence or love is regarded as the highest law of humankind. So Gandhiji has to be understood holistically. He cannot be understood in parts. Unless we understand his thoughts on religion, economy, education, health, politics, literature, society, and culture, we will not be able to understand Gandhi clearly. And that too, one needs to study and understand Gandhiji perfectly because he has written so much, and then adopt it to the context. His life was filled with many kinds of challenges, solutions, and achievements. He used truth as an experiment, not only in politics, but in his personal life too. So I think my time is running out now. So I will just wind up by saying the life and thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi are intertwined and inseparable. His politics was imbued with his spiritual experiments, and his spirituality was tempered by his vision of a non-violent society, and his constructive work was integral to his politics. The unique practices of Mahatma Gandhi, the control of palate, his fasts, his spinning, his silence, and his prayers were as much a part of his politics as of his spiritual life. These practices and experiments were sustained and nurtured by the inmates of the ashrams that he founded. The ashram community, through its own practices, affirmed, modified, and validated Mahatma Gandhi's ideas and practices and continues to do so even till today. This shows the relevance of his practices. So, I would also like to tell you that the two important factors that brought Gandhiji closer to people are the genuine inspiration he was able to offer to the self-respecting and freedom-loving citizens. With his selfless service, he demonstrated the spirit of service which was not driven by any personal or ulterior motive, desires. His experiments won him respect from even those who opposed him and those who never met him or knew him. So after Gandhiji passed on, all the organizations which were founded by Gandhiji during this time in India were merged together under one umbrella, and it was called the Sarva Seva Sangh. That was spearheaded by Saint Vinoba Bhaveji, who started the Bhudan Yatra in 1952. So all the Karyakartas who are part of the ashrams all over the country joined in the Bhudan Yatra, which continued for many years, and the land was distributed to the landless. Later on, it was time for Gram Swaraj. And again, all those organizations had to be sustained. So a central place in Banaras was created called the Sarva Seva Sangh Sadhana Kendra. And my father took over as the secretary of Sarva Seva Sangh, and for 50 years continued to tread on the path Gandhiji showed to us. So this is what I wanted to say today, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. So this wonderful opportunity that was provided me for sharing my thoughts with all of you, I'm very grateful, and this is a very happy occasion for me to be among such important people sitting here and to be able to share my thoughts, my experience, my understanding of Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you so much to IIT Kharagpur and to Professor Subrata Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Dr. Radhakrishna, for summing up Gandhiji's philosophy and thoughts so succinctly and expanding the scope of the discussion beyond Sarvodaya and Swavlamban to the essential ideas like Satyagraha, Ahimsa, Swachhata, and so on. I have a lot, the symposium has raised a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. I'm sure the other listeners who are listening to you also have a lot of questions. But since we are running short of time, I found that I'm sure the speakers did not plan it, but there was a thread connecting what each of the speakers said from making the most vulnerable section of people, the women working in the unorganized sector, self-reliant as part of Sarvodaya, and to Dr. Ryan, Professor Ryan talking about making cities self-reliant. And if the cities, what is the place of the precarious workers or the unorganized sector in the cities? And finally, from the listening to Sarvodaya and Swavlamban, right from the horse's mouth, from somebody whose father has been part of the movement. So I think that we should spend the rest of the time we have, the few minutes we have, to bring you in conversation with one another rather than ask specific questions. If time permits, I have some questions for each of you, which I would put to you. But I would like you to carry forward this conversation where you were speaking to one another without knowing you were doing it. But now if we can bring together these ideas into a general free-for-all panel discussion where each of you may speak on any of the themes which the others talked about or expand on what you yourself said to bring the discussion to a close. May I begin with a question then?
Sure.
Yeah, to kick off the discussion, maybe I could begin with a question. The first question was for Professor Sanyal. In view of the size and enormity of the unorganized sector, the informal sector in India that the present crisis has thrown up, and you did mention that Seva has inspired not just India, but the world. How do we tap this unexplored sector, which is on which we have no reliable figures? How do we use it to meet the twin goals of A, to become self-reliant by using the skills of the unorganized sector, and to bring upliftment for everyone?
Thank you. What is interesting about these informal sector workers is that they are self-reliant already. They depend only on their meager income. So we don't need to preach them about self-reliance. What we need to do is to help them earn a little more than what they can, give them better health, give them better housing, so make their quality of their life well enough so they can live a dignified life. And what I notice, and what is a puzzle for me, this will be interesting, is if one organization starts taking on all the aspects, including income, housing, health, environment, etc., it becomes very difficult organizationally to manage. Even though we know that the problem of poverty, etc., comes out of a set of integrated factors, lack of education, lack of political participation, lack of income, but that doesn't mean in doing things that the integrated problem has to be answered in an integrated way. It sounds logical that an integrated problem requires the integrated solution, but organizationally, it's very, very hard to do. And I think that that's what has happened with the many of the movements that have started, inspired by Seva and others. The NGO movement in India, including Working Women's Forum in the South and many other groups, that I noticed that they are expanding in scale. And there's a lot of pressure on them to expand in scale because donor agencies, etc., tell them, how many people are you serving? The numbers, they want the numbers. But I think that if you really worry about the quality of the program you're doing, I think picking one issue that you know a lot about and pursuing it in a multiple ways. Legislatively, legislation has to change. Many legislation has to change. Economically, by giving them access to credit, etc., education, giving them access to land for housing. So it's a collective. It has to be a collective solution. It cannot be done by one organization alone. Yeah?
Thank you, Professor Sanyal. I would put the next question to Professor Ryan before I throw it open to all the panelists. Professor Ryan, I was quite fascinated by the neighborhood concept you introduced, and you said it goes back to UK and how you connected the neighborhood idea in India as well as New York. I was thinking of driving through New York City, taking the bus actually from Times Square, and thinking of all the villages one passes through, Hispanic villages, from Chinatown to the Hispanic villages, and then my journey stops in Harlem. So my question is, how has the gentrification of the neighborhoods? I've been going to Harlem for the last maybe 12 years or so, and I was dismayed to see that the Harlem I saw 10 years ago is gone. The African American women and the Ethiopian women who walk proudly in their sarongs and their ethnic outfits, they have been kind of run out by the Columbia University professors who have rented houses in the neighborhood. So what happens to the neighborhood when it gets gentrified? And is it possible to preserve these neighborhoods and keep them self-reliant as they were?
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting one that strikes at some central dilemmas, I think, in urban planning. In fact, if we were to ask some of our students what they think are maybe the most pressing questions beyond sustainability, of course, many would say gentrification. It troubles many of our students, and the struggle to stop gentrification has been a very active one in American cities, of course, as you yourself note. It's a struggle that has not entirely succeeded. Before I think of some positive steps we might take, I'd like to remind everyone that the concept of self-reliance, Gandhi's concept of self-reliance, of course, spoke to the positive, proud aspects of self-reliance, of determining one's own destiny, of not having one's fate shaped by others, of separation, but separation in a positive sense. Self-reliance in American cities has not always meant that, unfortunately. Sometimes self-reliance has been connected to concepts such as social and economic isolation, even segregation. And I think neighborhoods like Harlem embody the kind of two-faced quality of self-reliance. Harlem was in fact self-reliant in part because its inhabitants were isolated and restricted from having access to other economic functions of the city. And I was also struck by this actually in some villages that I visited in Gujarat. In fact, Indian villages, as you know, are highly pluralistic, composed of a multiplicity of different populations and sectors of society. Even within a small space, it's surprising sometimes. Self-reliance is there, but also a kind of segregation between different sectors, even in a small village. So the purpose of urban planning is a very challenging one, actually, as you have noted. It's twofold. It's both to increase self-reliance and to increase a neighborhood's ability to shape its own destiny and to be independent of outside forces that would push it in the wrong direction. But it's also to permit that neighborhood and that population to have access to the larger benefits of the city. The right to the city, as it's been termed by Henri. So how do we accord the right to the city, but also self-reliance at the same time without opening up a neighborhood? You can think of the same challenge in, of course, India's economic policy. When I first got to India in 1994, there was no Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola came in and purchased all of the homegrown Indian cola corporations, is my understanding. So that self-reliance and globalization didn't necessarily go together. I went back to Jane Jacobs, who was one of the early thinkers who talk about the neighborhood self-reliance and about the ability of a built environment to provide for self-reliance. And I think to the concept of pluralism that I'm very interested and engaged in with respect to urban design thinking. The more pluralistic a neighborhood, both as a built environment and as a social and economic environment, the more niches and spaces there are, both for marginalized populations and for diversity to retain hold in a place where there may be strong outside forces acting. So I have hoped that Harlem will, to some extent, resist that overall gentrification because Harlem is a highly pluralistic built environment, a lot of social housing, a lot of small buildings, old buildings that Jane Jacobs would have loved that condition. I have hoped that Harlem, to some extent, will be able to retain that interesting dynamic quality of self-reliance that we so admire. But I think urban design has a very important role. The larger and cruder the scale of urban design that we see in places like Hudson Yards in New York, or I think in places like the South City Mall in Calcutta, the more we create cities that are too large in scale, what Kevin Lynch called a gross scale, coarse scale, the less we can permit that kind of self-reliance and self-determination to remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ryan. Bengalis would think of the Para culture near South City Mall and the Mohalla culture in the north, where Mohallas are self-reliant and Paras aim to be self-reliant. I have a final question for Dr. Radhakrishna, after which I would like you, all the speakers, to have a say on any theme that they would like to talk about. Dr. Radhakrishna, sorry. Can you hear me? Dr. Radhakrishna, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have a very important question for you. Having been raised in the ashram yourself, and looking at the declining interest in Gandhiji among the younger generation, except in kitschy images of Bollywood films where it became fashionable to do Gandhigiri, I would like to ask you, how do we pass on his message? How do we inculcate Gandhian values in the new generation, which is so hung upon global consumerism rather than self-denial, rather than asceticism? How would you transmit them?
That was a challenge for Mahatma Gandhi also. In 1936, when an American priest, Dr. Moore, had come to meet him at Seva Kamash, he had a couple of questions to ask. And one of the questions was, he asked Gandhiji what was the biggest challenge in front of him. Maybe Dr. Moore thought that it was the poverty, or unemployment, or illiteracy, or any of the many problems that were at that time very prevalent. But Gandhiji said that the biggest challenge in front of him is the callousness of the middle class intellectuals. And here, how we, the Gandhians, demonstrated by living it. We have devoted our entire life to public service. Take Gandhiji's ideas forward. Giving an example from my own work in Bihar, I would like to tell you that we worked for a long time with Dalit women, and that too in Bodh, which had seen a lot of agitations and violence during the land rights movement. And now the question was that the first interest that we had was to organize these women at the panchayat level, form self-help groups, and then network them onto a bigger body of Mahila Shanti Dal to practice non-violent conflict resolution. And later on, as the women started becoming very vocal and understanding their needs to express themselves clearly, we linked them up with the banks, started saving programs, and all other usual programs, and then linked up with Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, Mahila Samarthya, the banks, and other panchayat level programs. So the only way one can demonstrate to the young generation is by our conduct, by living it. And that is the only way that comes to my mind. And the next way, which I have been doing these days, is telling the story of Gandhi in the form of a narration so that people get interested in studying, understanding Gandhi and put their hearts into it, learning more about Gandhi, reading up and practicing what he had said, because Gandhiji called himself a practical idealist. Whenever he saw something, heard, or saw or read, he immediately started practicing on it. So the most important thing for Gandhiji was action. He had said, an ounce of practice is worth more than tons of preaching. So therefore, these are the two ways, according to reach out to the younger generation.
Thank you, Dr. Radhakrishnan. We have actually overshot our time, but even so, we would like to end this discussion without a free-for-all session among all of you. And I would invite all of you to speak on any of the themes, Sarvodaya, Swavlamban, and Satyagraha, if you wish, in conversation with one another before we bring this very interesting discussion to a close.
I want to share one thought I had as I was listening to everybody. Because this session is sponsored by the Indian Institute of Technology, and also we are from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are also participating. The word technology is very important, and I think it's a central idea in modernization theory. In economic development, it's industrialization, and people have also used it in social modernization with education, political modernization, refining democracy. So I would like to ask the panelists if they would like to share their thoughts on how is Gandhiji's idea of technology and technological change, its relevance now, because as every nation on earth is trying to technologically upgrade themselves. Maybe Dr. Radhakrishnan would be able to comment on it.
As long as one was able to keep the values intact, experimenting with the technology was quite all right. And this is where, while I was telling you how to reach out to the young people, it is also through the technology that we need to address young people's queries. And IIT Kharagpur is doing a very important thing in this regard in partnership with IIT Gandhinagar and the National Science Museum and the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. All the literature of Gandhiji has been put on this platform, social media platform, and through artificial intelligence, they have created the networks and temporary places and people. And it's called the Gandhipedia. I'm the advisor for the Gandhipedia, and I'm very excited about reaching out to young people through that platform. So that's something which I wanted to add.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Professor Ryan, you might have something to say on technologies.
Very briefly, I would say that I've always felt that technology is a double-edged sword. Technology both permits decentralization and self-reliance, but it also, in a sense, inhibits it. Of course, the self-reliance that we're all experiencing these days is tremendously enabled by technology. Each of our homes becomes a kind of an office we're all self-provisioning intellectually and socially, in a sense, through the benefits of technology. But of course, that type of self-reliance had to be a consequence of technology rather than its cause. So I remain, in a sense, concerned that technology, in a sense, requires globalization, or is inextricably interwoven with globalization, and that a vision of fully self-reliant communities couldn't develop the technological means to allow us to keep moving forward into a sustainable world. And that dilemma is one that I think about a lot.
Was anti-technology. He was against technology. But from reading Hind Swaraj, and in fact, I did go into Hind Swaraj some time ago, I found that your de-industrial model fits Gandhiji's ideas of technology. And I wonder, maybe if the final word can be from our honorable director, because he's been doing a lot of work on appropriate technologies. So Gandhiji is not really against technologies, but more into appropriate technologies. So our Rural Development Center, led by people like our honorable director, have been doing wonderful work in the area of appropriate technologies, which are relevant to our nation. So perhaps that would be one answer to technologies, how they can work, how they can be related to Gandhian ideas. So would you like to say something?
Very nice. I'm very grateful to each one of the speakers, and I learned about Swavalamban, Sarvodaya, and the philosophy of Gandhiji. It seems Madam Sobhana came to IIT Kharagpur sometime in March. Is it that? And you're talking Gandhi Katha? Possibly you came. Yes, I attended your lecture for about 10-15 minutes sitting because I came in the end, and I did not want to disturb at that time. And unfortunately, since I had to go out the next day, I could not meet you. But it was great, and it was good that the students from schools were attending that. I think one way of spreading the technology of spreading what Gandhiji meant was through the way which you are doing, and maybe your organization is doing through the culture. I know that IIT Kharagpur, IIT Gandhinagar, and Ministry of Culture has done something, and in fact, I was wondering that after Gandhiji left this world, I think very few people know about him, in the sense that why I'm saying like this is that we have only roads named after him and all that, but many other things have been named after some other Gandhi sort of things. But somehow I was feeling that there is a great relevance of Gandhiji in this particular world today, and particularly so in this pandemic. Because as you said the other day when we are going for the dry run, you said that it started at 4 o'clock in the morning, the prayer, and then 7 p.m. I think the ideals which were taught in the ashram, and those are the things which are required today, because they will keep the person fit, they will keep the person conscious, and they will keep the person immune from any sort of a disease or misleading his own mind whatsoever, and always active in helping others. And I know that in helping others, everybody derives a lot of pleasure, and that is the essence of life. This is what I have learned. Well, the question which Madam Anjali wanted me to say about technology. Yes, technology has overcome, and the present time, I think, which our Sanyal ji wanted is that because of the technology that we are sitting at different locations in the world and we are still communicating with each other. Possibly he meant that way. But the appropriate technology, what Gandhiji in fact had said, that production by the masses are not mass production. In fact, he has said that. But if you take the industrialization from that point of view, and if you take the industrialist point of view, there is a time required, because today we had the Jansankhya at that time, and today although we have 130 crore people, the people actually for work are not available. And the best problem I can tell you is in agriculture. Now, in agriculture, we have diminishing in the labor part, the people are not available to work on the farms. And that is why where we need technology. In fact, the high-end technology and use of image analysis, use of artificial intelligence and machine learning and embedded systems have been incorporated in some of our designs of tractor-driven equipment, etc., which are being used for increasing the production, because people have increased and the land has also shrunk because of the modernization and because of the housing of the people, etc., and the infrastructure for creation of these people to keep in this world, and particularly in this country. Therefore, we have to increase the production. And there, since the hands are not available, as Gandhiji said, today we have to think of the technology and high-end technology so that we can produce more from the same land. In fact, the land has decreased, but we have to produce more to feed more people. And this is very important. Appropriate technology, yes, there was a talk about 15 years back. We used to talk about that tractorization is not going to help, but there should be appropriate technologies at various levels. For example, you know that 60% of the people here are small and marginal farmers. So these farmers, they do not have the money to buy big machines. But then if they are, the work has to be done, how they will do it, because people are also not available. And hence the appropriate technology came up in the sense that they should have small tools and equipment which they can use in their farm. But having said that, at that point of time, today after 15 years, we feel that in fact it is very appropriate that we should have technology which will serve all sorts of people, in the sense that small farms, big farms, medium-sized farms, and all that. And that is why the technology has to come into every form of life in human beings, stay from the morning to the evening, as we see. And technology has to play a great role in, as I was talking about urbanization, as well as he was talking about the philosophy of life, which is so prominent and so particular in this particular pandemic time. And as you have said about the seva organization, in fact, today in every part of the world, you know that there are various organizations, NGOs, who are working for the downtrodden people, who are for the masses, who do not have even, they cannot get food also for the whole day. So there are small NGOs who are still working. Self-help groups have come up. Even several women self-help groups have come up to help the society in large way. And there also there is need for the technology to help them now. You were talking about how to increase their income, etc. I think the one way will be that if these people are given certain, you said that integration could not be done, fine. I think I agree with you. But Sanyal Saab, but what I feel is that they could be given skill up their activities, or maybe new skills by which they can earn more, and hence they can have better living. So, and that is the talk which our government today is talking, that we should have education with skill, and the vocational which was talked of earlier, which was not seen in the same mainstream education, is going to come back into the main fold of education. And hence the education that these people have to be imparted must be in such a way that they can have their skills, they can earn more, not necessarily only talking of jobs in the organized sector. So with this, I think I thank each one of you. Very nice. I learned a lot from each one of you. And I think, yes, technology has to work. And Mahatma Gandhi was relevant, is relevant, and will remain relevant in this world so far as the humanity will exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tiwari. We have run the whole gamut of themes, from Sarvodaya and Swavlamban to Satyagraha and to appropriate technologies. All good things must come to an end. We have all been listening so intently that we have lost track of time. I think we need to bring this, our listeners also have been listening very intently. We
I'd like to say a few words on this. Yeah, just.
Well, good evening, everybody. And I was patiently listening to all of you. First of all, I must thank you for sparing your time and discussing the very relevant things of Gandhian philosophy. As it is being said, we are at the Indian Institute of Technology, and IIT Kharagpur, as you know, that has two extremes. In fact, where we talk about space research, we talk about the rural development as well. So, and I was just wondering when Professor Tiwari was talking about that, yes, through the Gandhian philosophy, you said the Sarvodaya, Swavalamban, and we are really working through the technology. Today, we are talking about new education policy, in fact, which talks about embracing all, going to the people, create awareness among masses, and spread the education. And I think the technology is the thing which can do and serve the purpose. So in a great way, in fact, I must say that the Gandhian philosophy is being followed and is very relevant and has relevance. And again, as Professor Tiwari said, that it was relevant, it will remain relevant in future as well. I thank you once again to you all on behalf of IIT Kharagpur, on behalf of my colleagues, on behalf of the team who have organized this. And I'm sure that we'll have many such occasions to discuss these views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. The final word, of course, belongs to our Dean Alumni, Professor Subhuto Chattopadhyay. I request Professor Chattopadhyay to sum up the main points of the symposium and bring today's symposium to a close.
Thank you very much, Professor Anjali. And I must say that I'm so fascinated. I mean, this has been one of the most enlightening and fascinating evenings that I've had during this pandemic. I learned so much, and I'm really relearning many concepts, many thoughts, and a lot of impressions are coming my way. It has been an excellent journey. Thank you, Professor Bishoprio Sanyal, for taking us through the entire movement of NGOs, taking the relevance of Seva and how it has transformed. Thank you very much, Professor Brent Ryan, for bringing up issues and topics starting from Ebenezer Howard to Clarence Stein and Clarence Perry, and also touching upon Jane Jacobs. So it was like, a journey through urban planning, and the way you integrated urban planning to your topic was fascinating. Gives me some idea for future talks with you, and we will do that. And thank you very much once again, Shobna ji. I mean, you have lived Gandhian way, and you have really you have been doing a great job by bringing it to the forefront, bringing it to people, the masses. I learned so much from you, and I would definitely like to be in touch with you for future references. Thank you very much. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. So our session now comes to an end. Thanks.
Thanks to Anjali.
Thank you. Thank you very much.